Some people just win, not because they're the smartest in the room, not because they're the richest or have the most power, but because they seem to know something the rest of us don't. They walk in, sit down, and by the time they leave, the deal, the job, the agreement, somehow it's tilted in their favor. It's not magic. It's not luck. It's a skill. And one of history's greatest masters of it was Napoleon Bonaparte. The year was 1800. The French army was camped in the bitter cold. Inside a dimly lit tent, Napoleon sat at a wooden table, a map of Europe, spread before him, pins and ink stains marking the fate of nations. Across from him, the Austrian envoy sat stiff and composed, his uniform pressed to perfection, his eyes cold and calculating. Between them, silence. Not a word had been spoken for nearly a minute. The envoy thought Napoleon was thinking about troop movements. He was wrong. Napoleon was thinking about him, his breathing, the twitch of his left eye, the rhythm of his fingers tapping whenever the pressure built. Finally, Napoleon leaned forward and said softly, "You came here to talk peace, but you have already lost." That day, Napoleon walked away not just with an armistice, but with land, resources, and an agreement so one-sided it was practically a gift, not because he was stronger, not because he had more troops, but because he used 3 hidden negotiation tactics that turned the conversation into a battlefield. One he had already won before the first word was spoken. Today, I'm going to take you inside that room to show you how Napoleon negotiated, outmaneuvered, and walked away with more than anyone thought possible. By the end, you won't just know the tactics, you'll be able to use them. Preparation. Win before you begin. Napoleon's first secret was simple. The deal is won before the meeting begins. Let me take you back to the night before that tense Austrian negotiation. While most generals slept or drank themselves into a comfortable haze, Napoleon was still at his desk, not reviewing troop formations, but studying people. He read reports on the Austrian envoy's personality, his past decisions, his weaknesses in diplomacy. He wasn't just thinking about what he wanted. He was calculating 3 versions of the deal. Plan A, his ideal, everything he wanted, and more. Plan B, what he could live with and still call a victory. Plan C, the bare minimum that still moved him forward. This gave him a psychological shield. Why? Because most negotiators walk into the room with only one outcome in mind, and when that outcome slips, they panic. Napoleon never panicked because he had already planned for every scenario. And here's the kicker. Napoleon always had a hidden card, something unexpected he could throw on the table if the talk stalled. Sometimes it was a military movement the other side didn't know about. Other times it was an unrelated gift or gesture that made the other side feel they were getting a bonus without realizing they'd conceded the real prize. Then there was the setting. Napoleon never negotiated on equal ground, literally. If possible, he chose the location. He picked rooms where he could control the temperature, the seating, even the food. The Austrian envoy, for example, was hosted in a small, slightly cold tent with low lighting. Napoleon knew discomfort makes people want to finish faster. Every minute the envoy sat there, he'd feel just a bit more eager to agree and less willing to fight over small details. The lesson here? Before you negotiate anything, salary, business deal, even a personal favor, secure 3 things. Multiple fallback plans so you can't be cornered. A hidden advantage the other side doesn't expect. Control of the environment, because setting changes psychology. Napoleon didn't step into the Austrian tent hoping for the best. He stepped in already knowing how the conversation would end. Communication, charm, like a friend, speak like a commander. Here's the part that surprises people. Napoleon wasn't all fire and fury in negotiations. He didn't bark orders at diplomats. He didn't throw threats around unless he absolutely had to. Instead, he used his second secret tactic: mask strength with charm. When the Austrian envoy first arrived, Napoleon greeted him warmly. He offered coffee, spoke about the weather even, joked about the long ride to the camp. The envoy, expecting hostility, relaxed. Napoleon understood something most people miss. When your opponent expects aggression and you give them kindness, you disarm them. It's the conversational equivalent of lowering your sword, only to pick it up later when they least expect it. But charm was only the opening act. Once the real conversation began, Napoleon spoke decisively. His words were short, clear, and confident. He didn't flood the table with information. He dropped carefully chosen facts, each one designed to frame the discussion in his terms. For example, instead of saying, "We want this territory because it benefits France," he'd say, "It is only reasonable that the land return to its rightful owner after the sacrifices we've made for peace." Notice the shift? One sounds like a demand, the other sounds like justice. Another part of his communication strategy was shaping the narrative. Napoleon never let the Austrians define what winning meant. He set the terms early, framing concessions from their side as steps toward harmony, and concessions from his side as extraordinary generosity. By the midpoint of the negotiation, the envoy wasn't arguing over whether to give Napoleon something. He was arguing over how much. And that's exactly where Napoleon wanted him. The lesson? Charm opens the door. Clarity walks you through. Framing locks it behind you. The power play. Strike when they're weak, win when they're willing. By now, the envoy was tired. Hours in the cold tent had worn him down. The back and forth had chipped away at his initial resistance. This is when Napoleon unleashed his third secret tactic, the power play. The power play was a mix of 4 moves. Strike when they're weak. Napoleon waited until the envoy showed the smallest sign of doubt, a sigh, a pause before answering, before introducing his biggest demands. People are most likely to give in when they're mentally fatigued, give generous but strategic concessions. Napoleon would reluctantly agree to small things the envoy wanted, things he had already decided were meaningless to him. This created the illusion of balance and made the envoy feel he was winning, even as Napoleon took the real prize: divide and conquer. If there were multiple Austrian voices in the room, Napoleon subtly played them against each other, praising one's wisdom in front of the other, making them compete to be the reasonable negotiator. End on a win. Napoleon always made sure the other side left the table feeling they had gained something. A happy opponent is less likely to fight back later. By the end of the meeting, the Austrian envoy had agreed to terms far beyond what his government had expected. And yet, he left believing he'd struck a fair deal. Napoleon, of course, knew better. Napoleon's genius in negotiation wasn't about tricks or deceit. It was about control. Control of the plan, the environment, the conversation, and the closing moment. He understood that every deal is a battle. And like any battle, victory belongs to the side that prepares better, communicates smarter, and strikes at the perfect moment. You might not be facing Austrian diplomats or redrawing the map of Europe. But whether you're asking for a raise, closing a business contract, or even trying to get your kids to agree on bedtime, these tactics still work. So remember, win before you begin. Charm like a friend, speak like a commander. Strike when they're weak, win when they're willing. And here's the truth. Negotiation isn't about getting everything you want. It's about walking away with more than you had, and more than they ever planned to give you. Napoleon didn't win every battle, but in the rooms where history was written, at tables, not trenches, he rarely lost. If you want to play the game of life at the highest level, learn to negotiate like Napoleon, because when you do, the world stops being a battlefield you survive in.